Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to our third webinar in this series, Pathways to Prosperity, Building Strong Communities for Business Success. We started this series to engage businesses on community issues that are affecting business and prosperity in general. And this issue for today is a big one for New Hampshire, affordable housing. This partnership successfully created a fund to capitalize with investments from 8 major Upper Valley employers to provide loans for affordable housing. And we're going to hear directly from people who are involved in the partnership and in the execution of the project. Today, our speakers include Clay Adams, the CEO of Mascoma Bank. Mr. Adams holds an MBA from the Tuck School at Dartmouth College and a bachelor's degree in government and environmental studies from Dartmouth. He's also a board member of the Montshire Museum of Science and the Ford Sire Memorial Ski Council. He's one of several Vermont business leaders chosen by Congressman Peter Welch to serve on the Business Advisory Council. The bios, as you would imagine, for this panel is extensive, so we are going to share a link with the lengthy bios in the chat. Next, we have Ms. Deborah Flannery. Deb joined Evernorth as its Vice President of Lending in January 2021, with responsibility for formalizing and expanding Evernorth's lending platform. Deb brings over 25 years of professional experience in affordable housing, including leadership roles in private sector consulting, state and local housing finance agencies, and most recently with a nonprofit community development finance institution. And finally, our moderator slash panelist, Alan Reeds. In 2016, Reeds was offered the Hanover Co-op's newly established position of Public Relations Director. In addition to a full array of public relations duties, he expanded his longstanding work in local and regional collaborations and substantially increased public affairs involvement for the co-op. In 2018, Reeds became the Hanover Co-op's first Director of Public and Government Affairs to expand the co-op's advocacy locally, regionally, and nationally. And he's serving double duty for us today because of his extensive knowledge of the program. So I will hand it over to Mr. Alan Reeds.
Thank you so much, Zena. And I'm really grateful for those in attendance today. It's an important topic. And this particular topic is one that's gathered quite a bit of attention after this fund was established. And I must say, to have team members like Deb Flannery, Clay Adams, and the others who were involved in establishing this fund, the other businesses, is a bit of the secret sauce, but there's more to it than just a little magic and the aligning of stars. Yeah, I'll just set the stage, and then we'll get right into the details of what makes this program special and effective. Corporate Counsel is a body of mostly larger employers in the Upper Valley region. Recently, it's expanded to bring in more small businesses. So the voices at the table are getting larger, but we also recognize that not all voices can be at a table. So this is really a community-focused effort. While you'll hear of a small group of employers, you're going to be hearing about those employers who are focused on the greater community issue, and we'll get to those details in a moment. The Corporate Council is convened by Vital Communities, which is based in the Upper Valley. It looks at a number of critical issues from housing, transportation, agriculture, the environment, and many more that I have a hard time keeping track of. And it was through the Corporate Council that this idea really found its footing. And with that, Clay, I'll turn it over to you to give us a bit more context and start to take us through this story.
Sure. Thank you, Alan. Pleasure to be here and try to help the Granite State move forward on this pressing issue. To build on what Alan was saying, the Corporate Council has been around for quite a number of years. And I'd say over the past 7 or so years, members, and there are about 24 different members, as large as Dartmouth Health, Dartmouth College, Hypertherm, and then companies like ours that number in the hundreds of people, and still some smaller. But all of us, regardless of sector of business or size found ourselves struggling with housing and trying to attract employees, and finding that housing was often a reason they couldn't accept a job, or if they did accept a job, they kind of had to revoke that, and because they couldn't find a place to live. And so it's an equity issue, but we were also viewing it very much, in all honesty, as somewhat in a self-interest economic development issue. In the role of a person who leads a community bank, you talk to a lot of different businesses as well, in every day, in my world, and they're all struggling with this. And so we began, I'd say, more actively engaging in the discussion, not just about this fund, which I'll get to in just a second, but about using our voice to advocate for more inclusive zoning. There have been multiple occasions when Alan and I and other business leaders have shown up at select board or planning meetings to throw our support behind a project that's going up. It might be workforce development oriented, or a zoning change that will allow for more housing. It makes a huge difference when business uses its voice for things like this, because that's not often the case. It's people who are much more opposed to projects where these things kind of happen. On the fund itself, this was an idea that isn't, like many, wasn't original. We heard about a model that had been done in metropolitan Boston, and it was kind of suggested that we follow this, but it was going to be done on a statewide basis. And banks do a lot of statewide housing fund work, and that's how we know Evernorth, who does that for us. And I think our conclusion was that we may have more success if we start this on a more regional basis, which the Upper Valley region of the Connecticut River, I think, would constitute that. And so we thought about how to do that, how to put our money where our mouth was, and invest our own capital in a solution that would help the greater region, but also help create homes for those of people we were trying to hire or retain. And so that's when we reached out to Evernorth to help us look at this and conduct a feasibility study, and really ascertain whether there was demand from developers for something like this, whether municipal leaders thought it would be a good idea, and certainly employers. And so we wanted to get those data to understand if there was universal acceptance of us pursuing something like this, which is then the role that Evernorth helped us with at that point. And this may be a good point at which Deb could speak to how that feasibility study worked and what they found. But before I'll hand that over, the Upper Valley is not unlike any other. And just as of recently, and this is the NIFA New Hampshire Housing Study, this is statewide. It's 0.6% vacancy rate for rentals. 2-bedroom in Grafton County has risen more than any other part of the state at 82%, I believe, over the past 5 years. So it just really, really is critical. And this has gotten only worse since we really started talking about this fund 2+ years ago. So Deb, off to you.
Thanks, Clay, and thanks, Alan, for the great intros. So I think what I would talk about is really how we got down to details. And so when you start at the corporate council level and all this groundwork that was being done before we became involved, I think of that as really conceptual and high level thinking and planning and consensus building. But where we came in, we had to start thinking more in detail about what are we talking about when we say we have a shortage of housing, for whom, how does that look if we address it? And so those were the kinds of questions that we started to sort of process as we got involved, because those are things that would tell us whether or not, one, it could align with Evernorth's mission, which is a nonprofit charitable purpose organization. And so we have a certain charge and duty to serve those and unmet needs, and not just sort of provide market rate housing to add, which is a perfectly valid thing to do. It just would not necessarily have aligned with Evernorth. So we really needed to get into the details of what was meant by the needs and what were the appetites for addressing them from this group. So we looked at a number of things, and I will just advance to the next slide, which I hope is working. Are you seeing the workforce housing rents slide? Okay, so we started talking about who are the folks that are really struggling the most. And so we began to look at households that had high burdens of rent, and that predominantly falls on households, it turns out, that are well below the median, so 80% below the area median income. And so this is just a picture in the sort of the two main counties that are straddling the Connecticut River there, Grafton County, New Hampshire, and Windsor County, Vermont. So this is a multi-state region. And we look at what the workforce rents are, what sort of cost people are bearing, and what are the core markets being served, and what does that look like? It looks like there's a differential here between what the workforce housing rents are at, what people can afford versus what the market rents are, what they're going to encounter when they go out into the market. And so you can see here on this slide that these are, quite different. So for example, a 2-bedroom unit in Windsor County, for a household in this 80% of the area income could afford $1,400, but the rents that they're likely to see at the time we started this, by the way, $1,700. Those numbers are going up in terms of the amount that rents are being charged. Rents are going up faster than income, so that differential is only growing since we started. But these were some of the assumptions that we put in play as we were working on answering these questions. So there's that gap is what we are looking for resources to address. And I think I missed a slide because I was probably clicked twice thinking I hadn't quite advanced. But these are two slides that go in tandem. And so it doesn't really matter which way you look at them. But what we were talking about is who are those folks I just mentioned, those income levels. And you can see here, we're talking about families or individuals basically living on wages of between $17 and $27 an hour. This captures a huge amount of the service industry market of folks that work in the service industry, as well as some entry-level professionals. So it's a very high need demographic, a very high need employment demographic for employers in the area, and also one of the most challenged to find housing. So you can see here what those incomes are kind of in a more granular way. And then a high number, we've also called out that a high number of those households, thousands of them, in fact, are.
We are still on the community context and corporate council leadership slide, so we're not quite seeing the slide.
Thank you.
So you have who lives in workforce housing is what we see now.
Okay.
That has taken us back towards the beginning.
Okay, I'm looking at this. I have a presenter view that is confusing me, so I apologize. Now I see.
No, that's no problem.
Okay. And it's covered up by the Zoom. So I see it now. Okay, sorry. So this is
we see one person household.
Yep. So this is where I'll look at the other screen to see my slide. So this is where you see the income levels that I was just referencing, the wage levels, and we just converted it to hourly. These are numbers that are provided annually by federal agencies that are focused on housing, but we think it helps to sort of break it down into the hourly rate to make really understand who we're talking about. So as the last thing I was just referencing is the final line on that table, which talks about the households that are rent burdened. So it's literally thousands of households that we know are paying more than 30% of their income, of a nominal income to start with, really what, when you consider all the costs that a household needs to maintain to have a standard of living. If they're paying more than 30% of their income, that's considered rent burdened. And so there's a very high number of those households in this income bracket. So that we established, and I think, received really good consensus from the group of the corporate council that were interested in pursuing this, that this was really a good target and a good place for us to focus our energies. So this is, again, the workforce rent slide, which we already discussed. So as we looked at the sort of landscape of what was happening in the housing market, we realized as well that some of the barriers that were causing projects either to not get built or to happen more slowly than would be desired, to sort of not be at a pace that can keep up, is that the financing capital stack didn't always have sufficient resiliency or flexibility to help projects move through the process timely. And it really didn't have to be something that would fully fund a new housing development that we could come up with that would make the difference. But we thought about what could be a catalyst, what could be a smaller piece of the capital stack, because we know housing is very capital intensive, and this group is not going to, contribute hundreds of millions of dollars, which is, to fund the whole effort. So we looked at how could we fill the little gaps and try to create some momentum and accelerate the pace of housing. So we came up with a revolving loan fund model and proposed that we would have investors make a loan to the loan fund administrator. They chose to work with Evernorth, but it could have been another entity. So I have the 8 employers showing here on the left as the investor group, Evernorth in the middle as the fund manager, and as the fund manager taking on the risks of the project investments. So then taking the capital from investors and matching it up with projects within the region that's sort of advanced the goals of the investors. And because of Evernorth's experience as a housing developer, a tax credit equity syndicator, and now a lender, we have contact with a lot of those types of projects. We understand the work that's happening in the space, and we know what's attracting other kinds of capital that is needed to make these units possible. So we have that intel, that intel that maybe just a sole investor out there doing some other line of business wouldn't have. So we were able to be matchmaker and identify qualified projects and then make those investments. So that is the basic model. As those projects pay off their loans, the funds flow back and then get repaid to the investors. So that's basically why it's considered a revolving structure, is it comes into the fund, it goes out to the projects, and when it comes back, it gets repaid to investors. So that's a very simple just way of describing a revolving loan fund. It's not a complex concept. So in order to bring value to projects in a way that would allow them to use additional capital, we had some really clear premises that we were working off of, just understanding this particular market. And that meant that we were looking for investors to make long-term commitments. We wanted the projects to be affordable for a very long time upfront, and even potentially into perpetuity if it could attract other sorts of subsidy program dollars that would also secure longer term, even lifelong commitments to keeping the units affordable to the targeted households. So we wanted funds to be long-term. We needed them to be low cost, because most of the projects that would be building housing for this population would needed to be at a below market rate. And so we proposed a fund of $10 million with these investors getting all of their money back plus an interest rate of 1.5%. So not a market rate at all for these investors, very charitable rate. We asked for 3 years to actually deploy the funds. So once we would secure the commitments from investors, we would need then time to go ahead and connect with the projects that were in the pipeline. And we understood too that projects that are being built in this way take a long time to go from concept to completion. And so we wanted to be able to intercept them early in the process when they were still in the pre-development planning stages, to help identify them and help get into the capital stack early in order to make the most impact and help the project faster. So we're intercepting projects very early, maybe a year before they are going to start construction, or a few months before they'll start construction, but at various points when they're assembling their other sources of funding. So we needed a lead time in order to make these funds get into projects. So that's a 3-year period called our deployment period. And then in terms of a management fee, I'm sure lots of folks have heard about how you have funds and managers and management fees. And this structure just it does cover the cost of the work that Evernorth would be doing, but it's done through just allowing for a spread on the interest rate from the investors. So the investors are giving the funds to Evernorth, or loaning the funds to Evernorth at 1.5%. And the investors agreed that Evernorth could loan it out at up to 3.5% on average in order to take that 2% spread as their fee. So that's what is proposed and what has been set up. And then additionally, in order to just add a layer of protection for investors, the loans were to be made and held as assets by Evernorth, but to add that layer of protection, Evernorth has agreed to pledge those underlying loan assets back to the investors as collateral. So those are the terms of the commitments that we have now in the loan fund. And as we looked at what kinds of financing would be helpful in this catalytic way, we identified some key ways in which the funds could be used, primarily to do new construction, but potentially to do some acquisition rehab to restore units that may be offline, to restore them to stable housing for folks. But we put some limits, and I'm not going to go through this in detail. This slide will be available for anyone to look at. This is sort of a little bit bankerly jargony, but really just sort of thinking about how we would spread these out in order to accomplish the unit mix that we wanted and to not expose ourselves to too much risk with a single project. So these are some of the sort of guardrails that we put in place. But we left ourselves a lot of flexibility. So one of the things that we know is needed in this industry of real estate development, of housing, especially when you're trying to make it affordable, is you need flexibility, because there are a lot of things that are not flexible, and there are a lot of things that are changing and uncertain as you're in the process. And so we wanted to create flexibility so we could fit in as needed, where needed, and when needed, without a lot of major constraints on the developer in order to help overcome other things that wouldn't move. So we could be flexible and help overcome challenges that other parts of the capital stack or process might create difficulty. So that's what we have, is a very flexible tool to invest in projects.
Thanks, Deb.
And with that,
Yeah,
I turn it back to Alan to talk
very
about.
good. Thank you. And I've been through this presentation, let's just say a few times, and it fascinates me about the complexity of it and the teamwork, as well as the impact that Evernorth has had. You know, a conversation I had with Deb earlier this summer, I posed the question on, breadth of involvement in this level of work. And she shared with me Evernorth's New Hampshire numbers for low-income housing tax credit properties, over 100 properties that Evernorth has been involved with or still involved with, that has produced over 4,000 units. So it's critical to have a partner like that. And it's critical to have a partner who's patient. Because when we first approached Evernorth, as Clay described in the corporate counsel setting, it was the RFP for an RFP. It was to say, well, we kind of want to do something, but we really are not housing people. We certainly, you've got Mascoma that's been involved in so many development projects, but there's a difference in terms of really doing the work that we were asking for. And so it was through Deb and Evernorth's involvement that the feasibility study meant coming back time and again to the corporate counsel team. So this is where I'm getting into the nitty-gritty of the conversations that led us to this important point. Because I think that anyone on this call who's considering doing this should take note of a few of these critical points. Yes, it's a common community conversation. Anybody who's been in an effectively run board meeting knows that good things happen, and there's some pull and give and take. We were kind of in different territory because you had 7 or 8 employers in the room, or really on Zoom, because most of this happened during the pandemic. And so there was not as many opportunities for face-to-face. And so when we had those conversations, it's like, wait a second, you want me to go back? You want me to, let's see, I could maybe put up $1 million or maybe even $2 million, but I'm to go to my board of directors and say, oh, and guess what? We're going to earn 1.5%. Bear in mind, these conversations were happening in 2020 or 2021 before interest rates really started to go up. And yes, the answer really was because of the sound model that Deb really laid the foundation for, that said, if we're going to make this happen, yes, at 1.5%, and you'll get the principal back in 15 years. And then there came the question of, can we get a master lease for some of our employees? Can we at least, if you're going to build a unit with 100 apartments in it, could those of us who are donating to the fund at least get 30% of the units? And ultimately, that was a very difficult conversation. It wasn't contentious, but it was difficult. And I recall distinctly as we had talked about that on more than 1 or 2 meetings, and it kept rising to the surface again. And it was Dick Jennings, who was with Mascoma Bank at the time. He spoke up and he said, when businesses lead on issues like this, politicians and administrative agencies pay attention. We need to be out and lead on this and show that we're not doing it merely to find important housing for our employees, as well as it's difficult to be an employer/landlord. It can happen and it's worth considering, but this wasn't the conversation. And so it was through Dick's wise statement and careful conversation that we all agreed, let's build or help assist in the building of projects so we can address the important need and step up. And Dick's comments were spot on, because very quickly we had great attention from municipalities who'd heard of it and saying, can we get you, Deb, and Clay on a call? I'd like to have you talk to our select board. This must be the 10th time that we've presented on this issue, and I'm so glad NHBSR has provided the opportunity to record this so it can be up and available long term. And I also want to, give credit to a strong chair. Clay was involved so much in these conversations, not only chairing those meetings, but there was a lot of effort to secure commitments that I'll, in a moment, turn it back to Clay to discuss. But I want to wrap up by this part of my comments to say that as you bring, if you're considering doing this and you're bringing a team together, the voices that you bring in will be the magic, right? People who can collaborate. But I would also say that please always consider those voices who are not at the table, who don't have the stature in a community to speak up. And the numbers that Deb shared earlier about the rent-burdened households and Clay's comment about rents going up 82% in 5 years and getting worse. They're not going to get better, or the issue of housing is not going to get any better if we sit back. So I'll have a few other comments to share in a minute about involvement and getting in the game in any way you can. But for now, Clay, I'd really like to have you give a perspective on securing some of those larger dollar commitments. And, it's critical what you did, and I look forward to having you share it.
Thanks, Alan. I'll pick up where something you were saying a moment ago, where I think very credibly, those investors were asking is like, well, can we earmark some of these units that come into these buildings on a pro rata basis based on the investment we put in? And Dick Jennings, I think, spoke very eloquently about it, as you said, and Dick, who's now retired and ran Mascoma Community Development, which does a lot of multifamily affordable housing. Works with Evernorth. But I think, one of the other conversations or thread in that was that, hey, look, the people we're hiring want to go to places where restaurants where there are servers. And because if you can't have servers because they can't have housing, because it doesn't exist, then those restaurants aren't going to be able to function. And so really to have a vibrant economy for all businesses and institutions that employ people in a region, you have to have a viable housing market. And so that's a little bit at what we're aimed at here. I also have to chuckle at the slide Deb put up before. I mean, and as Alan mentioned, the return for these investors is 1.5%, which 2 years ago, when the Fed had short-term rates at 0, and it's now at 5.25 to 5.5, that was a reasonable return, because people were not getting, there weren't CDs at 5 to 6%. And so we timed it. We were lucky in our timing. I'll just say it that way, to be able to offer something that is more reasonable. A home mortgage these days is 7.5 to 8%. And so that's really, there's a tremendous amount of pressure because of the way of the Federal Reserve's actions to shrink the tame inflation. So that's a little bit of context, but I think there were some very technical things that we had to work through in the loan documents. And again, credit to my colleague, Dick Jennings, working with Evernorth to hammer those out and working with lawyers. Loan documents for any kind of project can be voluminous, but then how did we boil that down for the businesses who were really the investors? And I think we've all been involved in a lot of conversations about, well, I can take the bull by the horns and solve this problem on my own. We're going to build housing on our own as an employer. And I think our perspective on this was, hey, look, let's let the experts decide where and when and what the units are that are going to be built. Let's put some constraints around what those are. Here's the target of the workforce, as Deb said, which in Grafton County was kind of at the time $15 to $25 an hour. We're all struggling with that. Many of us who run businesses have a large portion of our workforce that kind of fit in that category. And so once we kind of got through some of the technical things, it was really paramount that we get some lead investors. And I kind of think this is almost like any nonprofit that is doing a capital campaign. You have to have, there's a pyramid of, you have to have some of the bigger ones locked in early so that others who may not have that capacity will follow that lead. And in our case, here in the Upper Valley, the two largest employers are Dartmouth College and Dartmouth Health, both of which were struggling with workforce housing. And so Dartmouth Health very quickly stepped up. Dartmouth College followed, and then others were able to go in. And there was definitely a little bit of education, not only on the technical aspects of what this will be, because a lot of these businesses don't make investments like this. They have to protect their capital so that they can deploy it for I'll say more immediate business needs, like adding equipment, adding a building, doing things like that. Like the hospital recently completed a wing. It's not typical for businesses to put money into projects like this that they don't entirely control, but they know, and it may have a longer term payoff. So it's an interesting, I think it's worked well for us at this point. Our target was 10 million. And I think at this point we're around 11. And one of the investors recently stepped up and did additional housing. And it's interesting that Sion Baylock, the relatively new president of Dartmouth, has made housing one of the pillars of her initial year of her presidency, and has cited this loan fund as a means of investing. And so I would say all of the investors have gotten on board. If I'm being totally honest, I think it would be a harder sell these days because the money supply has contracted, which is the intention of the Federal Reserve to tame inflation. So again, our timing was good. Just another thought: if this is the same advice that I've given to other communities and business leaders in other parts of New Hampshire, but also Vermont, is if you're in a community and you need this, you have to get the larger employers at the table and as part of the solution, because they're the ones who have, generally speaking, greater capacity from expertise, finance, and also from a capital perspective to help with this. And then you can kind of get other businesses involved. There is very much a power in numbers. You don't necessarily want to, in our view, exclude people because they can't do a 7-figure commitment. We took commitments as low as $100,000, which for an individual is a lot. For a lot of businesses is a ton. But it makes it more accessible to a broader number of businesses, so that when we show up at municipal meetings or we're talking to elected officials, they see, oh my gosh, there are 8 businesses of different shapes, sizes, for-profit, nonprofit, mutually owned, co-ops, employee-owned, and so it's really is a universal problem, and that will attract more support and attention from elected officials, other business leaders, and municipal officials.
Thank you, Clay. And along the lines of the attention that you speak of, I'd like to share just a few examples of that, and then we'll go back to Deb in our remaining 10 or 12 minutes or so to look at where we are now, what these funds are actually doing, because deployment has been underway. But I happened to mention this briefly to Representative Ann Custer. And she immediately said, I need a meeting. I need to understand this. And so soon thereafter, we were in a very small group meeting with Representative Custer. She took great interest in it. The same with Senator Shaheen. She joined us this summer for a community conversation where Dartmouth was at the table with the new administration, and Emma Wolf, their Vice President of Community Affairs, was there to understand what was going on in this effort. As well, the New Hampshire Business and Economic Affairs office, and Noah Hodgetts has been on more than a few calls to understand what's going on, to understand the dynamics of a relationship. And I'll say one other thing before passing back to Deb. The Hanover Co-op is one of those small fishes. Okay, we're a small fish in the big pond that's making this happen. We are a $100,000 contributor. There are entities that have contributed $2.5 million. It'd take 25 of us to equal that. But there are other aspects and efforts that we can play a role in, and this is one of it. But I'll touch on a few other things after we do the wrap up with Deb. So Deb, why don't you take us through a few of the important elements of progress that we've seen so far?
I would be happy to. So I'll just start with a quick slide of what we thought we would achieve with this fund. If it was $10 million, and we thought we would accomplish creating 260 housing units. And you can see here that they're broken. We estimated what percentage would be in what kind of income category. So we are hoping that and expecting that this fund would serve a mix of incomes, ranging from those that are, really more on the lower end of income, like 50% AMI, and that's about 27% of the units we think can target that group. Another 37% will target households at 60% of the area median, or $19 to $20 an hour. And then additional 30% would be for those at 80% of the area median, which is like $25 to $27 an hour. And then a small number of units we expect to be unrestricted for households at any income. And so that's what we thought we would do. And so the progress, what have we actually accomplished since we started with all the consensus building and the discussion? We have actually closed on a fund, and it was a dry closing, meaning we did not advance funds. We just got all the investors to commit to these funds that could be advanced by Evernorth on these terms that we've laid out here in this slide deck. We closed on it in August of 2022, so that we then, Evernorth, could get busy identifying good matches for those investor funds. And as we make those matches, we're committing to those projects capital. As Clay mentioned, we started with a $8.95 million, which wasn't quite our goal. And when we did the initial closing in August of 2022, and then just this October, a month ago or so, Dartmouth College did announce that they were going to increase their commitment to get us over that $10 million threshold. So we are very thrilled to see that. So we do fully expect to meet these unit production targets that I called out earlier, because we do now have all the funds in place. I would just want to mention, I named the investors here. I think it's so important to really appreciate the group of investors and their commitment and dedication, especially in this interest rate environment. As Clay mentioned, Mascoma is a lead investor. The Hanover Food Co-op stores is super important investor and champion of this effort, with Alan here, obviously. Dartmouth Health is a contributor, major contributor. Dartmouth College, as I mentioned. Hypertherm is involved. We have Citizens Bank is a committed investor. King Arthur Banking, and Bar Harbor Bank and Trust. So this is a combination of, the three banks, Mascoma, Citizens, and Bar Harbor, have invested with Evernorth's equity funds in the past. And so we're familiar with them. But what was really remarkable here is we were able to attract new capital from 5 additional corporations that is sort of dipping the toe in this water, which is what we need. We need to all be fully engaged. And so this was really remarkable in that way. So I don't want to gloss over that. This partnership is really valuable, and hopefully setting the stage for more to come. So that's the capitalization stage. And now we're in the investment stage. So we have between August of 2022, when we closed with investors, and August of 2025 to actually place commitments and funds into projects. And so far we have made a commitment as of last December, almost a year ago now, to a project under construction in White River Junction, and pictures of it here, the rendering of what it will look like when it's complete, and one while it was under construction earlier this summer. It's right on the border. I mean, you could throw a rock from New Hampshire and hit it. So it will serve, no doubt, folks from both states and employers from that whole region. We committed $1.95 million to that project, and as a permanent first mortgage financing. So it should be complete, by the end of the first quarter of 2024, and be starting to be occupied. So that is well underway. We're really thrilled to be part of that. We have 2 additional projects under review that we are far enough along in the underwriting that I believe I can safely say we should have those committed by the year end or soon after. And those will bring up our total commitments to more than half of the fund and will also give us the hope of creating about 127 units between those. So we do have other deals in the pipeline that we're working with, but we have these immediate ones that are likely to move forward and that we think represent good progress towards our goals. And so we're very excited to be able to report that. And that was it for my
Sure.
slides.
Great, thanks, Deb. You know, I get excited over this because we need to see action, right? We need to see impact. Conversation is important, but conversation doesn't build housing. It can lead to it, but other times we can get waylaid. We can get distracted with running our own businesses. As Clay pointed out, you know, it's one thing to say, I'm going to focus on the elements of our business and how our team can make an impact or buy new refrigeration for units that are failing. But this was something that the team jumped into, and team is often overused. I think we're very fortunate in this state to have a great team that goes along with the broad effort. We're going to be placing in the chat some links as well as making them available afterwards. And I just want to quickly skim through some of the things that you'll see in there. And these are resources that anyone on this call should spend a little time on. Certainly, there's NHBSR's Housing Principles. That's a sign-on opportunity for businesses, entities, and individuals to say sensible housing solutions are critical to this state and this region. Those principles allow not only your voice to be heard, but it allows NHBSR to step forth as to opportunities present themselves to say to legislatures, you know, this is a list of business people who are standing by this issue and want their name to be heard and understood as being a part of the action. There's great tool in the form of Communities and Consequences, the 2 movies produced by Jay Childs. And right now I have a link in there on a new series that Jay, along with the folks of Housing New Hampshire, have put together called Facts and Fiction, along with Sarah Reitzman. Please click on that. It runs about 7 minutes. Excellent tool. Keys to the Valley. Here's a deep dive for you. It does take a while to surf through this particular website, but it was the effort of a number of regional planning commissions up here in our region to say, what's a toolkit? And this is a toolkit to help both municipalities, advocates, as well as just people who are interested in learning more, sink their teeth in. And I put a particular link in there that's kind of neat because it's where they juxtapose a few pictures to say, here's an aerial photograph of a particular community, and now let's put in some housing where multi-units could exist. And you'll see that it does not change the character of any community. You know, sometimes the units can look more like the photos that Deb provided to us, and very appropriate. But that's a good one. Evernorth, you've just got to understand the importance of their work. So that's a link. The Zoning Atlas in New Hampshire, critical. And I was at a housing meeting recently where Ben Frost was talking about it, and he spoke up and he said, it's been referred to as the gold standard of housing atlases across the country. And what it does is it provides any visitor to that site a town by town breakdown on exactly what they allow for housing units, ADUs. And they actually found in producing this atlas, which was a big lift, that there are some communities where it's easy to build or allowable to build a 5-unit, single unit dwelling with 5 units in it. It's easier to do that than it is to build a duplex. So we're trying to straighten out some of the challenges within housing. And then, of course, Housing Action New Hampshire, Alyssa Margolin, just such a key player in this work. I put in a couple of links there on their news releases, as well as signing up for their alerts. So those are some critical things I wanted to bring to attention. And before I close in my last minute or so, before we go to Q&A, and please put some questions in the chat. And then Zena, perhaps if I can't see those, you can read them off. Clay mentioned something very early on, and it is showing up at municipal meetings. It's not assuming that a particular proposal for housing in your community will pass. There's been many meetings that I've been in the room with 2 or 3 of colleagues like Andrew Winter or Clay Adams or the folks from Vital Communities. There are other times where I'm the only person in the room, along with 29 empty chairs. But I'm able to speak up and support a select board that is really debating a difficult issue. There are other times that I'm in a room, and Clay's seen it as well, where there is really voices in opposition. And it makes a difference to be there in the front row, be willing to stand up early and say, thank you for considering this issue. I know there are folks who have concerns, and I'm grateful that this forum allows those concerns to be heard. Here's the view of not merely the Hanover Co-op, but here's our perspective as a community member. And those are critical issues. And if you assume that your voice won't make a difference, not having your voice heard at all allows others to fill the gap. So with that, I say thanks, and let's move on to some Q&A.
Alan, I just was wondering, the rates or the income levels that Deb shared were $16 an hour, and that's well above our minimum wage in New Hampshire, even considering 2 people working in the household. So it's not even addressing minimum wage earners, or are we assuming that most are getting living wage?
I think
Yeah, go
we
ahead.
were
Deb,
assuming for
please.
the most part that these would be working households. And so, yes, I think sometimes there could be more than one wage earner, you know, with incomes that equate to the average of that amount. But there's also other programs that allow folks that are below that income to receive subsidies directly in apartments. And those are things like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the federal HUD programs that give people a voucher to pay a portion of their rents. And those will be permitted in these units as well. So those households may receive a little boost to help them meet those rent requirements, even if their incomes are a little bit lower. But Clay, were you going to say something else?
I would just say I would like to have a conversation with an employer who can even consider paying minimum wage. I'm not saying whether they should. I don't believe I like the sustainable wage, but the labor force is so tight in the Granite State that I think most employers are having to pay well above that minimum wage number by quite a lot. I mean, maybe some parts of the state that's not the case, but certainly here in the Upper Valley, which is what Alan and I know the best, that's the case.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions? I know there are people that are working on housing issues in the audience. Any other questions from our audience members while we have the experts here, people who are directly involved?
Well, while you're waiting on those, I'll pass one back to Deb, because I'm forever curious on the minutia that was involved, and I don't expect you to go into all the details. And Deb, as you have a second, if you can stop sharing your screen. But you know, Deb, this work always strikes me as extremely complicated, and yet you pull it off because this has been a career for you, basically. So the expertise you bring is long, but was there a particular nut that was a kind of a tough one to get over, that once you got it squared, maybe it was employer relations? What was something that really stood out to you as being that one thing that you set to work on more than you thought you might?
I think it was even less a question with the group of the investor group, even more internally with our organization, was looking at you know, I think that the notion of workforce, who is the workforce, and who are the ones that are struggling the most. I think we have, at risk of sometimes making assumptions that we're serving the needs of all the folks that are in this income category that we're talking about. And we know there's a shortage of housing at all these income levels, but we hear a lot, we get pushed a lot to think up the level, up the income chain, because there's this word that gets thrown around called missing middle. There's people in the middle that don't have access to subsidies. And so we were trying to figure out what is that missing middle. And I think there's a lot of overlap is what I think we discovered, and what was interesting to see, once we broke it down. And I think that's part of the beauty of breaking it down to the wage rates, because it then puts it into real terms when employers know what they're paying and who they're paying that amount, and how many of those jobs it would take to pay the rent. It gets very granular and I think we've just lost track of how the distribution of incomes in our state are, where they are, and how much folks in these income levels are challenged on their housing costs. So I think that was just a big one for us. And I think it was interesting that we all came to a conclusion. And then the other thing I would say was really similar to that is just what you talked about earlier around the community benefit mindset, rather than the return for the employees of an individual employer. Could we master lease these whole units and only rent them to people in our company? Those kinds of questions. There was a real pull in that direction. And so that was a challenge, because it is completely understandable and, in a certain way makes a lot of sense. And on the other hand, is sort of practically not very easy. So I think I was just impressed with how people were willing to set that aside and move forward. And it's a really great thing.
Thank you. I see a question. What advice would you have for a single company trying to get a group of interested businesses together to try to replicate this? Clay, I'll toss that your way. You're pretty good at wrangling. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think I go back to the movie 12 Angry Men, which I think there's been a remake of it, but it might have been originally in the 50s or the 60s, but one person's voice prevailed. And I think there are a lot of movements that start that way. And I think it's just a matter of starting with one-on-one conversations with people who you think are businesses or institutions. In the case, Dartmouth Health, I think any hospital in the state is probably having this challenge. So if you live in a community with a hospital, I'd start there. Community banks, I think, are another area. I know, I certainly know that cohort, and they're well aware of this because, like Mascoma, they hear from a lot of different businesses. But it's trying to get others, I think, enlist others, and you start small, and then you build that network. So I think that I know in another part of our state that's happening. I was approached by it was a multi-faith group of people who were kind of informally meeting and wanted to address housing. And it's the same advice I said there. Go, here are the institutions in your community that are deeply involved in the community, that are likely to be places where they will help support this and take a leadership role. So that's kind of, I think, where I would start and build from there.
I will maybe tag on to that answer a little bit, because once you feel like you get some momentum going, how do you keep it going? And one of the roles that I played within the Hanover Co-op's involvement of this, it's been a long time member of the corporate council, but it's generally, in most cases, the CEOs of organizations or the business owner who is on these calls. But that's not always the case, or there are times where persons in those positions are unable to attend. And for me, I was in the position of what I like to say, I was the plus one. And it became a situation where I was always on the calls. And so I began to really build more institutional knowledge of the workings. And then I was able to really speak supportively to the process as it was going on. And then, due to the structure and the way you ran those meetings, it's what I also consider to be the power of the reply all. That when I would see a note come from Deb Flannery, or I would see an issue going back and forth, that I didn't treat it, if you posed a question to the group, I wouldn't just reply to you, I would reply all, not merely because I wanted people to see my input, but I also knew the importance of keeping the conversation current and active and being able to reply very quickly. Because when 2 to 3 days go before a reply happens, that's lost momentum in my world. And so I think that was very important in the process. Unless we have another question, I'd like to see if there's any closing comments, any final thoughts for you, Deb, on this effort and or where we go next.
No, I'm just grateful for the partnership that we've had and for the journey we've been on, and I look forward to what's next. So that's it for me.
Thanks. Clay, final thoughts.
And I will just say, Alan, you're underselling yourself. You're far more than a +1. You're like a +10. So thank you.
Good leadership gets followers, and I'm a follower. So thank you. And thanks to NHBSR. I think this entire webinar series is really what this state needs. New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility is a name that says it all. That if businesses don't speak up, show up, stay at the table, and bring others to the table, but do something else. Go to others, the table of others. We can't simply convene in meetings and expect to truly understand the lived experiences of others. We have to get out and understand and speak and stay committed, because no business can thrive in a failing community. And that's what we're about. This is not about business bottom line. This is about community resilience, and it's up to us to do it. And so my thanks to our panelists today. It's a blast working with you, and also NHBSR. Your work is critical, and always happy to show up at your table. So thanks so much to Zena and Michelle and Deb and the team there. And I appreciate your work.
Thank you. And we appreciate you. And we appreciate you all giving us some of your time to share this experience. And we will be sharing slides, recording, and list of resources with registrants and attendees. And I know many registered that could not attend live and are waiting for that recording. I will put a link to the resources under the YouTube recording as well, so they have access to those. And just to let you know, we have a few things coming up. If Debbie, you could share. After this, the next in our series of Pathways to Prosperity, we'll be tapping into the hidden workforce. There's a massive pool out there of talent that small businesses can benefit from with second chance hiring, whether it's recovery-friendly workplaces or rehabilitation after incarceration. We are going to discuss how that happens and the opportunity that exists within that. Please follow our Pathways to Prosperity program and go ahead and register for those webinars as well. And then in November, we have other programs going on. Our Bear in Mind Mental Wellbeing in the Workplace series is going to address the epidemic of loneliness in the workplace as the holidays approach. So please go ahead and register for that. We also have a climate challenge series that is open to everyone to participate in. We have Hypertherm, one of the partners in this program, coming to discuss their climate goals and how they incorporated their sustainability within their green teams. And we are doing a panel on addressing transportation. So a lot of important topics coming up. And I'm off video because my internet is unstable, another critical issue in New Hampshire. But we welcome you all to upcoming conversations. Please take a look at our website and sign up for upcoming discussions. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you for allowing us the time and sharing your experience. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your week.